Jeff, I'd like to open up at least and talk about John Gerstner more generally and about your interest in Gerstner. But if I might preempt that, Jim had some interest in a little connection with Gerstner he wanted to prompt us with, and I think that might be a good place to launch from. Jim?
Yeah, so my connection to Dr. Gerstner is mediated. It's not a direct connection, but I'll always remember my 4.5 years pastoring in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and I'm sure Jeff has come across all this information in his research about Dr. Gerstner's life. But there was a time after he left the mainline church and joined the PCA that for a period of time at the end of his life, he served as an associate pastor at a PCA church in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. And there was an unfortunate split. I won't go into the details of all of that, but anyway, out of that division in OPC, congregation was formed. And Dr. Gerstner urged that group that they couldn't stay independent very long. And you could just imagine him with his gruff voice telling this group that they can't be independent and you have to join a denomination,
Right,
and
right, right, right.
all of that. So, and long and short of it is they eventually ended up in the OPC, and I came along as their second pastor. Their first pastor, our listeners who are really familiar with us will really appreciate this. Their first pastor was Danny Ollinger, and I was their second pastor. So this group was nurtured by Dr. Gerstner. They come into the OPC, and their first two pastors are flaming Vantillians, me, me and Danny Ollinger, and you could just imagine. Well, anyway, the group was the group has now been dissolved. It's no longer a church, but just very wonderful, sweet Christian people that I had the privilege of pastoring. They pastored me as well. They were very receptive of the word and cared for me, my family, and my first pastorate very well. But boy, you could imagine the conversations, the spirited conversations that I had with the other elders in that
I bet.
congregation about apologetics, because they were such passionate um, passionate disciples of Dr. Gerstner. They just loved him, and the stories they told about his love and care for them is just absolutely amazing. And so he is a remarkable man from everything I have heard. And when I heard this book come out, I was pleasantly surprised to hear of a biography being written about Dr. Gerstner, and picked it up. And Jeff did a great job writing this book.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Jeff, what's been your experience with Dr. Gerstner? What led you into an extended research project and even writing now this monograph on him? Tell us a little bit about your own personal history.
Yeah, well, I grew up in the PCUSA, and
Me
my
too.
father has been a PCUSA pastor here in Omaha for about a little over 25 years now. He's an associate pastor at a church, and then that church is now EPC. I joined EPC about 10 years ago. But when I was a freshman in college, I ran across Machen's book, Christianity and Liberalism. And that book was just so helpful, just in understanding the Christian faith, and just, love that book, and still, think very highly of that book, and just really, my college years really came to, admire Machen a lot. And then when I was in seminary, I went to, graduated from Wheaton College, and I went to seminary at Dubuque Seminary, that's where my father went as well. And there I read a book by Don McLeod called W. Stanford Reed, an Evangelical Calvinist in the Academy. And as you know, Stanford Reed was a student of Machen and an evangelical Canadian Presbyterian historian at McGill University and at the University of Guelph. And that book is just outstanding. It's an inspiring book, and just I can't say enough positive things about Don's biography of Stanford Reed. But that started to caused me to think about, is there someone similar to Stanford Reed, that I could write on here, in America, that, someone who was, conservative, evangelical, Presbyterian historian. And I thought about John Gerstner and did a MA program in history at the University of Nebraska Omaha, and then applied to the University of Stirling and in Scotland, and wrote my dissertation on John Gerstner with David Bebbington, who's a historian there at Stirling. So that's kind of what led me to write on Gerstner, and I would say too, in terms of at the time going through all this, I was PCUSA, and I just really felt that Gerstner had been marginalized, and even marginalized by a lot of evangelicals in the PCUSA. A lot of people didn't really know too much about him, even within the renewal movements. I mean, there's some mention of him, but not a lot. So I just felt that Gerstner is someone that really, had been severely neglected. And then also, if you look at, there's two histories of Pittsburgh Seminary. There's the Walter edited volume, and Gerstner receives no mention in that book,
Oh my.
which was published by Erdman's. Even though he spent many decades at the seminary and was a prominent figure in the seminary's history, received no mention. And then in the Don McKim volume, which is, both those books are good, but Gerstner is just he shows up in one small place in the McKim volume, and so I just felt that something more needs to be done with John Gerstner. And if you just look at his career, he was involved in so many important events and controversies, and in terms of the PCA in the North, in Western Pennsylvania, his former students got that started. The Ascension Presbytery with R.C. Sproul, and his involvement in Ligonier, and his his prosecution of Mansfield Casemont and the mainline church that led to the founding of the EPC in 1981. And he just, I think, is someone who deserves a lot more attention, and I think is, not given enough credit for really standing firm for biblical truth, and really kind of continuing Machen's fights, out into the second half of the 20th century. I think a lot of the work that he did really continued those important discussions and debates and controversies, continued them in the second half of the 20th century. So I think, Gerstner, and the other part of this too is that the UPC-NA denomination and people associated with it have been severely neglected also within the field of Presbyterian history. And Gerstner was a mainline Presbyterian church historian, but before that, he was the last seminary church historian for the UPC-NA, which was a more evangelical Calvinist denomination that merged with the PCUSA in 1958. So then I was able to dig into Machen's ties to the UPC-NA, and I think by looking at those ties, I think that we can see that Machen is more important than historians have actually realized, because Machen developed relationships with UPC-NA scholars at Xenia Seminary in St. Louis, and then he founded the League of Evangelical Students with those UP scholars, and that was a very important, renewal organization. And there hasn't been anything about Machen's involvement in that group. And now I have a paper on the League of Evangelical Students, which existed from 1925 to 1943. But I think, if we look too at the UPC-NA scholars after 1958, they were the ones that started the International Council on Biblical Inerrancy. Gerstner was at the first meeting of that organization, along with R.C. Sproul, and then the person that founded the ICBI was a person coming out of the United Presbyterian Church, graduate of Sterling College, a guy named Jay Grimstead. So the UPC-NA, I think, is they're given very little credit. and yet I think they're far more influential than historians have realized. So I've just been thankful to get this book, published and get Gerstner's story out there, and I think the book helps illuminate a lot of areas of our Presbyterian past.